Chapter 1. The Valley of Shadows. The valley stretched before him like a corpse laid bare, its lifeless terrain shrouded in the oppressive pall of perpetual twilight. Jagged peaks framed the horizon, their craggy forms stark against the blood-red smear of a dying sun that never fully set. The air hung thick with decay, every gust of wind carrying the faint, bitter tang of centuries-old rot. Skeletal trees clawed at the sky like penitents frozen in prayer, their twisted forms casting long skeletal shadows across the cracked earth. This was the Valley of Shadows, a place forsaken by the gods and cursed by mortals. From the crumbling parapets of his fortress, Roland surveyed the cursed domain he had claimed as his own. His crimson eyes, gleaming like twin embers in the growing dark, scanned the valley's edge, where the Greenskin horde massed in obscene numbers. The goblins skittered like rats, scurrying to prepare crude war machines of splintered timber and rusted iron. Orcs, hulking and brutish, bellowed to each other in their guttural tongue, their war cries reverberating through the stillness like the toll of a funeral bell. And there, at the center of it all, a towering figure clad in jagged armor, the war boss whose wada threatened to drown Roland's realm in blood and fire. He tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, its ancient blade sheathed at his side. The weapon bore no embellishment, only the wear of centuries of battle. Like its master, it was a relic of another time, a vestige of an age when honor and chivalry had meaning. Those ideals were dust now, scattered like so much ash in the winds of undeath. Roland's gauntleted hand rested on the cold stone of the battlements as he gazed down at the gathering storm. Here, among the ruins and shadows, he had made his stand against the eternal thirst that plagued him, seeking not redemption, but purpose. Ouch! The hour draws near, he muttered, his voice a low growl, each syllable carrying the weight of the centuries. He turned from the parapet and strode along the battlements, his cloak billowing behind him like the wings of some great predatory bird. Below, the courtyard of his fortress teemed with the shambling forms of his undead knights, warriors bound to his will by dark sorcery and the unbreakable chains of loyalty forged in life. They were his chosen, a grim host whose flaws had carried them to him in death. Flawed they were, but in their final stand, they would embody the nobility they had lost. Roland's thoughts returned to the horde. They would come at dawn, or what passed for dawn in this forsaken land. The Greenskins would break upon his walls like waves upon the shore, unrelenting and merciless. They would bring fire, steel, and ruin. Roland knew the battle was lost before it began. The horde was simply too vast, their numbers an unstoppable tide. But it did not matter. "Let them come," he whispered, his fangs glinting as his lips curled into a cold smile. His oath was not to win, but to stand, to fight, to ensure that even in the face of annihilation, honor endured. The valley, cursed and broken though it was, would not yield to the chaos of the Greenskin without a fight. The wooder in front of Warren had a weapon. In fact, as the first stars began to pierce the veil of crimson twilight, Roland descended the stairs into the heart of the fortress. The echoes of his footsteps mingled with the hollow clatter of his knights, preparing for the battle to come. He would lead them into the darkness, not as a savior, but as a sentinel, a guardian of a realm where the living had no place. Here, in the Valley of Shadows, they would make their final stand. Defeat was inevitable, but so too was the legend that would rise from their ashes. Sterem Interit. Chapter 2. The Gathering of the Damned. The ancient hall of the fortress lay cloaked in shadow, the flickering light of cold blue witchfire casting eerie shapes across the stone walls. Roland stood at its center, his imposing figure framed by the vaulted arches above. His crimson eyes gleamed in the gloom as he raised his hand, summoning his knights from the depths of their eternal slumber. The air grew heavy, charged with a dark energy that coiled and pulsed like a living thing. One by one they emerged. Sir Gagrin, the guilt-burdened knight. The first to step into the light was Sir Gavrin. His armor, once gleaming with the luster of a holy order, was tarnished and cracked, the sigil of a now-forgotten deity, barely visible beneath centuries of grime. His helm, tucked beneath his arm, revealed a face locked in an eternal grimace of pain. Gavrin's hollow eyes fixed on Roland, and for a moment, a flicker of his mortal soul seemed to shine through. Let's do this again. Duration, it is, Roland replied, his tone as cold as the grave. Your penance awaits. Gavrin nodded, his gauntleted hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. Once a paladin of virtue, he had betrayed his vows in a moment of weakness, dooming his comrades to slaughter. In undeath, he sought the redemption that had eluded him in life, even as the weight of his sins pressed down on his every step. Lady Muriel, the noble betrayer. From the shadows emerged Lady Muriel, her movements graceful despite the heavy plate mail she wore. Her once beautiful face was a mask of pale perfection, marred only by the faint trace of a scar running from her temple to her jaw. Her emerald eyes gleamed with cunning, even in death. "Roland," she purred, her voice a silken whisper that echoed in the hall. "You summon us to face certain doom." How predictable. She smirked, brushing a strand of spectral hair from her face. In life, Marielle had been a noble woman of renown, but her lust for power had driven her to betray her family, sealing their fate to secure her own ambition. Her beauty, once admired, now served only as a mask for the venom beneath. Yet even she, with her schemes and sharp tongue, could not escape the chains of loyalty Roland had forged in her cursed soul. "You serve," Roland said, his voice brooking no argument, "or you'll fall." She curtsied mockingly, her armored skirts clinking against the stone. "As you command." Brother Talric, the faithless priest. The room grew colder as the next figure entered. Brother Talric, cloaked in tattered robes that fluttered, as if caught in an unseen wind, carried an aura of death that even the undead found unsettling. His gaunt face was a map of ancient scars, his eyes sunken pits of shadow. In his hands he cradled a staff that pulsed with dark energy, its head adorned with the bones of some forgotten beast. "Master," Talric said, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "The horde will burn, if you so desire." A priest in life, Talric had abandoned his faith in the gods when they failed to save his congregation from plague. Turning to forbidden arts, he had sought to master death itself, only to succumb to the very darkness he had wielded. Now he served Roland not out of loyalty, but out of a shared disdain for the living. "Your power will be needed," Roland said, meeting the priest's empty gaze. "Do not squander it." Doran the savage, the dishonored mercenary. The last to arrive was Doran, a hulking figure who strode into the hall with a swagger that defied his undead state. His armor was a mismatched collection of stolen pieces, and his face bore the scars of countless battles. A sneer twisted his lips, and his eyes gleamed with a feral light. "So the boss finally calls." Doran growled, his voice rough and grating. "'Bout time we got some action." Roland's eyes narrowed. You'll fight because you must, not because you desire it. Doran chuckled, a guttural sound that echoed through the chamber. Once a mercenary, he had been cast out of every company he had joined, his savage nature and penchant for cruelty making him a liability. In undeath, his ferocity was tempered only by Roland's iron will, but the beast within him still lurked, waiting for the chance to strike. "I'll fight," Doran said, unsheathing a jagged blade. "And I'll kill." A host, bound by curses, Roland regarded the gathering of his knights, each a reflection of the flaws that had damned them. Together they formed a grim tableau of what it meant to be undead, haunted by the past, bound by curses, and noble only in their final purpose. They were his warriors, his shield against the tide of destruction that loomed on the horizon. "The Greenskins march," Roland said, his voice cutting through the silence. "They will come at dawn. We will stand against them, not for victory but for honor." The knights exchanged glances, their varied expressions betraying fear, defiance, and resignation. Despite their flaws, they would follow him into the abyss. The gathering was complete. The damned were ready. Chapter 3. Echoes of Life. The hall had fallen into a grim quiet, save for the occasional rasp of steel on stone, as the knights prepared for the battle to come. Roland stood alone at the fortress balcony, staring into the endless twilight that shrouded the Valley of Shadows. His crimson eyes, unblinking, seemed fixed on the distant fires of the Greenskin encampment. The flickering light reminded him of the hearths of his youth, a warmth that he could no longer feel. Memories stirred, unbidden, like ghosts rising from shallow graves. Sir Gavrin, the guilt-burdened knight. Roland's mind turned to Gavarin, his first companion in undeath. He could still see the young paladin in his shining armor, his voice ringing with the righteous zeal of one who believed in absolutes. It was a winter's night when they met. Roland, newly turned, had stumbled upon a band of knights under siege by a marauding warband. Among them was Gavarin, his sword arm swift and unyielding as he defended his comrades. Roland had watched from the shadows, fascinated by the mortal's unshakable faith. But faith, he had learned, was fragile. The siege had broken Gavarin, not through battle, but through betrayal. He had abandoned his post to save himself, leaving his brothers in arms to their deaths. By the time Roland offered him undeath, the paladin was a man consumed by guilt, seeking redemption in a dark master. Lady Miriel, the noble betrayer. The flicker of torchlight in the valley reminded Roland of the chandeliers in Miriel's ancestral hall. Her mortal life had been one of privilege and intrigue, a court of whispers and veiled threats. Roland had met her during a masquerade, drawn to her wit as much as her beauty. She was a predator even then, navigating court politics with deadly precision. But ambition had been her downfall. In her quest for power, she had poisoned her own kin, only to be betrayed in turn by those she had sought to ally with. When Roland found her dying on the cold stone floor of her family's hall, she begged him for another chance at life. He had granted her wish, though her new life was bound to him. Even in undeath, her schemes persisted, though now tempered by her understanding of Roland's power. Brother Talric, the faithless priest. The cold air seemed to hum with a faint, otherworldly energy, and Roland's thoughts turned to Talric. Once a devout man of the cloth, Talric had been a healer, a shepherd of souls. But plague had come to his village, and no amount of prayer could halt its advance. In his despair, Talric turned to forbidden texts, seeking salvation in the dark arts. His efforts brought not salvation, but ruin. unleashing an unholy curse that consumed his congregation. When Roland discovered the priest, he found a man willing to sacrifice anything to atone for his sins. Talric's embrace of undeath was not a rejection of life, but a desperate continuation of his search for answers. Doran the savage, the dishonored mercenary. The echo of Gavrin sharpening his blade pulled Roland back to the present, his thoughts lingering on Doran. The mercenary had been nothing like the others. Where they sought redemption, Doran reveled in violence. He had been a sellsword of ill repute, a butcher who fought not for honor or gold but for the thrill of bloodshed. Doran had crossed paths with Roland during a border skirmish, and while the vampire admired his ferocity, he despised the man's lack of discipline. It was only after Doran's band turned on him, leaving him for dead, that Roland offered him a place among the undead. Even now, Doran's savagery was both a weapon and a curse. Roland's reflections. Roland closed his eyes, allowing the memories to fade into the twilight. He thought of his own mortal life, a young knight sworn to protect his people and uphold the ideals of chivalry. Those ideals had led him to a duel with a creature of the night, a blood dragon who saw in him not an opponent, but a successor. The duel had been brief, its consequences eternal. He had clung to his code, even in undeath, believing he could wield the curse without succumbing to its darker impulses. Yet, as the centuries passed, Roland began to wonder if he was merely deluding himself. What did honor mean in a world consumed by chaos? And yet here he stood, preparing to face a horde that would not remember his name or his sacrifice. The Valley of Shadows was his to defend, not because it held any strategic value, but because it was his last bastion of purpose. The scout's report. A low growl interrupted his thoughts. Roland turned to see one of his skeletal scouts, its tattered cloak billowing as it knelt before him. "They march at dawn, master," it rasped. "The horde is restless." Roland nodded, dismissing the scout with a wave of his hand. He looked once more to the distant fires of the Greenskin camp, his resolve hardening. "They march to their deaths," he murmured. "And so do we." The past could not be undone, but the future was still unwritten. In the coming battle, he and his knights would carve their own legend, a requiem for the damned in a world bereft of heroes. We had some callers that were forced into battle. Chapter 4. The First Assault. The air was heavy with anticipation, the unnatural stillness broken only by the faint creak of armor and the soft whispers of the restless dead. Roland stood atop the eastern parapet of the fortress, his crimson gaze fixed on the tree line beyond the valley's edge. The Greenskins were out there, hidden among the skeletal remains of a long-dead forest. He could feel them, their crude cunning and barely contained savagery thrumming like a distant drumbeat in his undead senses. "Stand back." "Ye come," Roland said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. Sir Gavrin stepped forward, his sword already drawn. Even in undeath, the knight maintained the disciplined stance of a paladin, his every movement purposeful. Gavrin's tarnished armor caught the faint glow of witchfire from the walls, a testament to battles fought and lost. "I will lead the counter," Gavrin said, his tone steady, though his hollow eyes betrayed a flicker of something more. Resolve, perhaps, or the lingering vestige of a man who had once stood for virtue. Roland regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded. "Go. Show them what it means to stand against the damned." Gavrin saluted, his blade held high, before descending the stairs to the courtyard below. Roland watched as the knight gathered a small band of skeletal warriors, their bones clattering as they moved with unnatural precision. The gates groaned open, and the contingent marched into the twilight, their forms disappearing into the shadows. The first wave. The silence of the valley was shattered by the greenskins' guttural cries. From the shadows of the tree line, goblins scuttled forward, their crude bows strung with jagged arrows. Behind them came a band of orcs, their crude axes gleaming in the dim light. These were not the full strength of the horde, merely scouts, testing the fortress's defenses. But their ferocity was no less deadly. Gavrin led his force into the fray, his blade flashing as he cut down the first goblin to cross his path. The skeletal warriors followed in eerie silence, their movements mechanical but efficient. The greenskins roared in fury, the goblins darting around the larger orcs, seeking weak points in the undead ranks. The clash of steel on steel rang out across the valley. Gavrin fought with the precision of a man who had trained for decades, every strike a calculated blow. But there was more to his actions than skill. Roland, watching from the parapet, could see the way Gavrin shielded his companions, stepping into the path of arrows meant for others, cutting down greenskins before they could overwhelm the weaker skeletons. 2. Altera, Ingo Sulford. It was as if a spark of his old self had reignited, a paladin protecting those who could not protect themselves. Dexter began to erase a fragment of the stripe, a price paid in blood. For every greenskin that fell, another seemed to emerge from the shadows. The goblins swarmed the flanks, overwhelming the skeletal warriors with sheer numbers, while the orcs pressed the center, their brute strength threatening to break the line. Gavrin fought like a man possessed, his sword cutting through flesh and bone, but even he could not hold forever. An orc chieftain, larger and more cunning than the rest, barreled toward Gavrin, its massive axe raised high. Gavrin turned to meet the blow, his sword catching the axe mid-swing. The clash sent sparks flying, but the force of the attack drove him to one knee. The orc snarled, its tusks bared in triumph, but Gavrin did not falter. With a roar he drove his blade upward, piercing the orc's throat. The beast gurgled and collapsed, its lifeblood staining the ground. Yet the cost was high. The undead contingent was all but annihilated, the skeleton warriors shattered beneath the greenskins' relentless assault. Gavrin himself bore wounds that would have killed a mortal man, his armor rent and his movement slowing. Still he stood, bloodied but unbroken, his sword dripping with blackened ichor. Accumulating wounds create inflammatory pathogens and grow the victim's flesh, Jasmine said with a shrug. Victory and loss. As the greenskin scouts began to falter, the sound of a horn echoed across the valley. It was a sharp, discordant note that signaled retreat. The goblins scattered, disappearing back into the shadows, while the remaining orcs withdrew with growls of frustration. Gavrin did not pursue. Instead, he raised his sword in silent triumph, a gesture not of victory, but of defiance. When he returned to the fortress, Gavrin was met with the cold gazes of his fellow knights. Lady Muriel smirked from the shadows, her voice dripping with disdain. "A noble effort, Sir Gavrin. How, human of you." Gavrin ignored her, his hollow eyes meeting Roland's as he approached the parapet. "The scouts are repelled," he said simply, "but they will come again, in greater numbers." Roland nodded, his expression inscrutable. "You have done well." Gavrin bowed his head, but the faintest flicker of humanity still lingered in his gaze. For a moment, Roland envied him. The fallen paladin had fought with a purpose beyond survival, a purpose that had carried over from a life he could no longer claim. It was a reminder of the ideals Roland himself had once cherished, now buried beneath centuries of blood and shadow. As Roland turned back to the horizon, He saw the fires of the Greenskin camp burn brighter. The first assault was over, but the true battle had yet to begin. For now, they had won a fleeting reprieve, bought with the sacrifice of the damned. Chapter 5. The Siege Begins. The fortress shuddered under the relentless assault of the Greenskin wag. Their war cries echoed across the valley, a cacophony of brutality that reverberated through the ancient stone walls. From his vantage point on the central tower, Roland watched as the horde surged toward the gates. Crude siege towers, patched together with wood and scrap metal, creaked and groaned as they were rolled into position. Goblin archers peppered the battlements with arrows, while orcs bellowed challenges and pounded their weapons against their shields. The air reeked of sweat, blood, and crude fire oil, mingling with the ever-present scent of decay that clung to the undead defenders. Roland's knights stood resolute, but even they could not completely silence the groans of the skeletons and shambling zombies below, their jerky movements betraying no fear, but also no hope. Realizing it a struggle, Roland tightened his grip on the hilt of his sword, the ancient weapon of familiar weight that steadied his turbulent thoughts. The thirst clawed at him, a gnawing hunger that whispered promises of strength and invincibility. It would be so easy to give in, to unleash the full fury of his vampiric nature on the Greenskins and turn the battlefield into a blood-soaked abattoir. But honor, what was left of it, held him back. He had made a vow long ago not to be a monster but a knight. Even now, as the fortress teetered on the brink of destruction, that vow chained him, a fragile tether to a past that felt increasingly distant. "We'll have time enough," Wells said. They saw buildings of moorland past for over 4,000 years. After workouts, he closed his eyes, the roar of the Wall fading as memories overtook him. In life, he had been Roland the Bold, a knight of unmatched skill and virtue. He had fought for king and country, for the ideals of chivalry that had defined him. But those ideals had crumbled when he faced the blood dragon who had turned him. In that fateful duel, he had chosen survival over death, and in doing so, he had damned himself. Now, centuries later, he wondered if that choice had been a betrayal of everything he had once held dear. A deep bellow from below drew him back to the present. The Greenskin siege towers were drawing closer, their crude designs looming like grotesque monuments to chaos. A short distance below Haleth, a defiant rising dot was at his feet. Muriel's schemes. Below the central tower, Lady Muriel paced the inner hall, her gauntleted fingers tapping against the hilt of her rapier. Her emerald eyes flickered with a sharp intelligence that had served her well in life and in undeath. She glanced toward the gates, where the undead forces held their ground against the first wave of attackers. "Fools," she muttered under her breath, "defending this wretched place like it means something." Her thoughts churned, calculating the odds of survival. Roland was powerful, but even he could not hold against the full might of the Greenskin horde. The fortress would fall, and with it, the last remnants of their cursed existence. Unless, of course, she acted first. Muriel's duplicity had been her undoing in life. She had poisoned her own kin to claim their lands, only to be betrayed in turn. That betrayal had left her dying on the cold floor of her family's hall, where Roland had found her. His offer of undeath had seemed a salvation then, but now she chafed under his iron rule. Her gaze shifted to the shadowy alcoves where skeletal sentinels stood watch. Their presence was a reminder that Roland's control was absolute, his will a chain she could not break. But the Greenskins, brutish though they were, might offer a chance to escape this fate. If she could bargain with their war boss, perhaps she could secure her survival, even at the cost of her comrades. She turned to Brother Talik, who stood muttering incantations over a glowing rune circle. His gaunt face was bathed in sickly green light, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Talric," Miriel said, her voice smooth as silk, "do you truly believe this fortress can hold?" The priest didn't look up. "We hold because Roland wills it, as do you." Miriel's smile was tight. "Willing something does not make it possible. Perhaps we should consider alternatives." At that, Talric's gaze flicked to her, a warning in his sunken eyes. "You speak dangerously, Miriel." Verlaine shook her head. She laughed, a sound like the chime of broken glass. "Dangerous times call for dangerous thoughts. Don't you agree?" Talric turned away, his focus returning to the glowing runes. "Keep your thoughts to yourself, Lady Miriel. Roland's patience has limits." The first breach. The Greenskin siege towers crashed against the walls, their crude gangplanks slamming down to create makeshift bridges. Goblins poured onto the battlements, shrieking and flailing with jagged blades. Orcs followed, their brute strength smashing through the undead defenders. Turgavring, stationed at the eastern wall, fought with tireless resolve, his blade cutting down greenskins with each swing. "Hold the line!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the chaos. Roland descended from the tower, his presence a beacon of dread that rallied the undead. He waded into the melee, his blade moving with the precision of a master swordsman. Greenskins fell before him, their crude armor no match for his ancient steel. Yet, for every one he slew, two more took its place. "Fall back to the inner courtyard," Roland commanded, his voice cold and unyielding. The undead knights obeyed, their retreat methodical as they regrouped behind the second line of defenses. The greenskins roared in triumph, their advance slowed but unbroken. The gathering storm. As Roland surveyed the battlefield from the inner wall, he felt the weight of their situation pressing down on him. The greenskins would not relent, and Miriel's schemes were as transparent as glass. He would need to keep an eye on her, even as the horde pressed closer. The siege had begun, and Roland knew it would end in fire and ruin. But as long as he and his knights stood, the Valley of Shadows would not fall without a fight. Myers. Chapter 6. Trial by Fire. The sky over the Valley of Shadows seemed to darken further, as if the heavens themselves recoiled from the savagery below. From his position on the inner wall, Roland observed the greenskins assembling their crude war machines, catapults cobbled together from warped timbers and spiked wheels, wagons laden with barrels of volatile explosives, and massive battering rams fashioned from felled trees. The war boss's guttural commands echoed over the din, and the greenskins roared in response, their frenzied energy threatening to overwhelm the unnatural calm of the undead defenders. Roland's crimson gaze swept the battlefield. The war machines lumbered forward, pushed and pulled by goblins and orcs alike. It was clear their crude construction would not hinder their deadly purpose. With the outer wall breached, the greenskins now sought to obliterate the inner defenses. "Crude but effective," Roland murmured, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned to Brother Talric, who lingered near the edge of the battlements, his dark robes swirling around him, as if caught in an unseen wind. "In truth, Talric," Roland said, his tone a command, "you know what must be done. The forbidden arts." Talric stepped forward, his skeletal staff glowing faintly in the dim light. The air grew colder, the stench of death intensifying, as he began to chant in a language long forgotten by mortal tongues. The runes carved into his staff flared to life, casting eerie green and purple shadows across the stone walls. "Master," Talric rasped, his sunken eyes fixed on the advancing horde. "This will require more than the usual toll." Roland nodded, his expression unreadable. "Do it." With a final incantation, Telric thrust his staff into the ground. A ripple of dark energy spread outward, warping the very air as it traveled across the battlefield. The earth groaned and cracked, skeletal hands clawing their way from the soil, as an army of the long dead rose to meet the Greenskins. The Greenskins hesitated, their crude war machines grinding to a halt as their handlers stared at the emerging undead. Then, with guttural war cries, they charged. The risen dead met them with an unholy ferocity, clawing, biting, and striking with rusted weapons. Goblins screamed as skeletal hands dragged them down, while orcs swung their axes wildly, smashing bones but finding no satisfaction in their destruction. The cost of power. From the wall, Roland watched the unfolding carnage. Talric's summoned forces had halted the Greenskin advance, but it came at a cost. The necromancer's body trembled as the spell sapped his essence, drawing not just from the winds of magic, but from his very soul. His skin, already pale, seemed to wither further, and his eyes burned with a sickly green light. "Enough," Roland commanded, his voice cutting through the cacophony. Talric hesitated, his staff still rooted in the ground. "It is not finished." "Stop," Roland's tone left no room for argument. With visible effort, Talric withdrew his staff, the glow of the runes fading. The skeletal army continued to fight, but without the necromancer's power sustaining them, they began to falter. The Greenskins, sensing weakness, renewed their assault, their war machines rumbling back into motion. Talric collapsed to one knee, his breathing labored. Lady Muriel approached, her emerald eyes glinting with amusement and disdain. Out behind the citadel, Partu collapsed to the ground. "Well done, Brother Talric," she said with a mocking smile. "You've managed to buy us a few moments more. At what cost, I wonder?" Talric glared at her, his voice a low growl. "Spare me your venom, Muriel. Without my magic, the walls would already be ash." "And yet," Muriel replied, leaning closer, "you weaken yourself with every spell. What will you do when there's nothing left to give?" Fractures among the knights. The tension between them was palpable, but it was Sir Gavrin who intervened. He strode forward, his armor still streaked with the ichor of the Greenskins he had slain. His gaze fixed on Talric. But it was not anger that burned in his hollow eyes. It was judgment. "This sorcery," Gavrin said, his voice steady but cold. "It is an abomination. We are knights, not conjurers of unholy things." "Knights," Talric spat, rising to his feet. "You cling to the illusions of honor and purity. Yet here you stand, a servant of the undead. Spare me your hypocrisy." Gavrin's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword. "I fight for redemption, not for myself. Your magic serves only to deepen our damnation." "Enough," Roland's voice silenced them both, the authority in his tone undeniable. "This is not the time for division." He stepped between them, his crimson eyes sweeping over his knights. "Talric's magic holds the line. Gavrin's blade upholds our honor. Both are necessary. Do not forget why we stand here." The knights fell silent, though the tension remained thick in the air. Muriel smirked, her gaze darting between the two like a cat watching cornered prey. Morel joined them, and the three joined the others, finding perfect seating in the armchair. Fragile unity. Roland turned back to the battlefield. The Greenskin war machines were advancing once more, their crude catapults hurling flaming projectiles toward the inner wall. The undead forces rallied, but the cost of Talric's spell had left the defenders weakened. The fragile unity among the knights would not last forever, Roland knew. But for now they would fight together, bound not by trust, but but by necessity. As the first flaming boulder struck the wall, sending shards of stone and bone flying, Roland drew his sword. The siege was far from over, and the trial by fire had only begun. Chapter 7. Whispers of Betrayal. The battle raged on as the Greenskins pressed their siege, crude war machines pounding against the fortress walls. From the parapets, Roland surveyed the chaos, his undead senses attuned to the ebb and flow of the battlefield. The flames from the greenskin catapults painted the sky in hues of orange and red, the acrid stench of smoke mingling with the ever-present decay of the valley. Yet even amidst the cacophony of war, a strange disquiet gnawed at the edges of his awareness. It was not the greenskins that troubled him. It was the silence from within his ranks. Miriel's bargain. Lady Miriel moved through the shadows of the fortress, her steps silent against the worn stone. Her emerald eyes gleamed with a mixture of cunning and desperation. She slipped past the skeletal sentries, their empty sockets unseeing, and reached a small postern gate hidden in the outer wall. Beyond the gate, the greenskin encampment sprawled like a festering wound. Fires burned high, as goblins and orcs alike feasted, brawled, and sharpened their weapons for the next assault. At the center of it all was the war boss, a hulking brute encased in jagged armor, his tusks glinting in the firelight as he barked orders at his minions. Miriel approached with deliberate care, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. The goblins guarding the war boss snarled and brandished their weapons, but she spoke in a tone laced with authority and intrigue. "Take me to your master," she said, her voice steady despite the roiling pit of unease in her chest. "I bring an offer. He will want to hear." The goblins hesitated, but ultimately stepped aside, allowing her to approach the towering orc. The war boss turned to face her, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the fire. His eyes, gleaming with intelligence rare for his kind, narrowed as he took her measure. "What's dis?" he growled, his voice like the grinding of stones. "A skinny humie? What do you want, corpse?" Miriel lowered her hands, her lips curling into a sly smile. "I am no mere human, war boss. I am undead, a knight bound to the blood dragon who leads this fortress, but my allegiance is flexible." The war boss snorted, his tusks twitching. "Flexible, eh? You lot don't bleed, but you still scream when I crump you." His hands shook. "Perhaps," Miriel conceded, her tone smooth. "But I can give you something more valuable than screams. I can give you the key to the fortress." The war boss tilted his head, interest glinting in his beady eyes. "Talk fast, corpse. My lads are hungry for blood." Miriel leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Spare me, and I will open the gates for you. The blood dragon will fall, and the valley will be yours." The war boss grinned, his jagged teeth gleaming. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. Maybe I'll let you live long enough to see your master fall." The betrayal uncovered. Unbeknownst to Miriel, her movements had not gone unnoticed. A spectral figure detached itself from the shadows of the fortress, its form translucent and wreathed in faintly glowing runes. Brother Talric had sensed the disruption in the magical wards and followed her, his silent presence concealed by his mastery of necromancy. When Miriel returned to the fortress, slipping back through the postern gate with a self-satisfied smirk, she was met by Roland's crimson gaze. He stood in the dimly lit hall, his sword unsheathed, the ancient blade glinting faintly in the witchfire light. "You are seen," Roland said, his voice low and deadly. Behind him, Talric emerged from the shadows, his staff glowing with the remnants of his tracking spell. Muriel's smile faltered, but only for a moment. "Seen doing what, exactly?" she asked, her tone still laced with feigned innocence. "Conspiring," Talric hissed, his sunken eyes burning with fury. "You would barter our lives for your own survival." The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of Sir Gawain and Doran. The knights took their places, forming a grim semicircle around Muriel. Gawain's expression was one of cold judgment, while Doran's sneer hinted at savage amusement. "You presume much," Muriel said, straightening her spine. "I merely sought to buy us time, to deceive the Greenskins into underestimating us." Roland stepped closer, his presence looming. "Do not insult me with lies, Muriel. Your ambition was transparent in life. It remains so in undeath." The confrontation, the tension in the hall crackled like the air before a storm. Gawain's hand moved to the hilt of his sword. "You would betray your own kin, as you did in life." Muriel's eyes narrowed, her voice sharpening. "And you would pass judgment, Sigavrain? How many lives did you condemn with your cowardice?" Gawain's face hardened, but he did not respond. Roland raised a gauntleted hand, silencing the escalating argument. His gaze remained fixed on Muriel, his voice cold as the grave. "You have made your choice," he said, "and now you will face the consequences." Miriam's composure cracked, her defiance giving way to fear. "Roland, please. "Silence," Roland commanded, his tone brooking no argument. "You will remain under my watch until this battle is done. If you so much as breathe out of turn, I will end your existence." The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of betrayal hanging heavy in the air. Muriel's treachery had fractured the fragile unity of the knights, and Roland knew the wounds would not heal easily. But there was no time to dwell on it. The siege continued, and the Greenskins would not wait for the undead to mend their broken trust. As Roland turned to leave, his voice echoed through the hall, a warning and a promise. "Let this be the last betrayal among us. The next will not be met with mercy." Chapter 8. Blood Oaths. The great hall of the fortress was silent, save for the faint whisper of the witch-fire torches that lined its walls. The flickering light danced across the cold stone, casting long shadows over the gathered knights. Roland stood at the head of the room, his crimson eyes scanning the faces of his companions. Sir Gawain, Lady Muriel, Brother Talric, and Doran the Savage formed a grim assembly, their undead forms a reflection of the curse that bound them. Roland had summoned them here not for strategy, but for truth. "Better. The cost of undeath." "You know why we fight," Roland began, his voice a low growl that filled the chamber. "We stand against the Greenskins, not for glory, nor for survival, but because it is the only purpose left to us." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The knights listened, their expressions unreadable, but the tension was palpable. "In life we were flawed, each of us," Roland continued. "We betrayed, we failed, we fell. And in death, I offered you a chance to fight again, to find meaning in the ashes of what we were. But that chance came at a price." He stepped forward, his gaze piercing each knight in turn. "You are bound to me, not by honor or loyalty, but by blood. My will is your will. My curse is your curse. And when the battle ends, whether in victory or defeat, you will not find peace. Your servitude is eternal." Sir Deverin straightened, his hollow eyes gleaming faintly. "We have always known this, Roland. We chose to follow you." "Did you?" Roland countered, his tone sharper now. "Or did you choose because there was no other choice?" "I will not pretend to be a savior. I am your master, and this fight is not for redemption. It is for one simple truth. We stand because we must." Moment of defiance. Lady Muriel stepped forward, her emerald eyes narrowing. "And if we no longer wish to stand? What then, Roland? Will you command us to march to oblivion simply because you cannot let go of your precious ideals?" Roland's gaze locked with hers, cold and unyielding. "If you no longer wish to stand, you are free to fall. But understand this, Muriel. To fall in undeath is to lose all. No memory, no self, only silence." Her defiance faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. Roland continued, his voice now like steel. "We are not here for ourselves. We are here because we are all that stands between this valley and annihilation. You may despise me for what I've made you, but you will fight, because that is all that remains." The commitment to the cause. Brother Toleric, leaning on his glowing staff, spoke next. "We may be cursed, but you speak truth, Roland. The living have their gods, their fleeting hopes. We have only each other, and this purpose." Sir Gavrin nodded solemnly, his gauntleted hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "I do not fight for redemption, but for the chance to uphold the ideals I once betrayed. If that means eternal servitude, so be it." Doran the Savage chuckled, the sound rough and humorless. "You lot can talk about ideals all you want. Me, I fight because smashing greenskins is the only fun left in this miserable existence, and I'll take it." Roland turned to Lady Muriel, the last to speak. She hesitated, her sharp mind weighing her options. Finally she inclined her head, her voice soft but resolute. "Very well, Roland. I will fight. Not for you, but because I refuse to fade into nothingness." Satisfied, Roland stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the assembled knights. "You are damned, every one of you. But in our damnation we find purpose. Remember that when the horde comes. Stand together, and let them see that even the dead can defy oblivion." The blood oath. With deliberate precision, Roland drew his blade and held it before him. "Kneel," he commanded. One by one the knights obeyed, bowing before him, in a gesture both solemn and binding. Roland slashed his palm, the blood that welled up gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. He let it fall, a single drop on each knight's brow, the magic binding them flaring faintly as it was renewed. "By my blood, by my will, and by the curse we share," Roland intoned, his voice echoing through the hall. "You are mine, and I am yours. Rise, my knights, and face the darkness once more." They rose as one, their gazes steady, their resolve unshaken. In that moment, they were not just undead warriors. They were bound by something greater than loyalty, an unyielding defiance of their fate. As the knights dispersed to prepare for the next assault, Roland remained in the hall, staring at the crimson stain on his blade. The truth had been spoken, and the bonds reforged. Now, all that remained was the battle, and the blood that would be spilled. Chapter 9. The Broken Gate. The thunderous crash of the battering ram echoed through the fortress, shaking the walls and sending a cascade of dust and debris raining down. Roland stood atop the inner battlements, watching as the greenskins renewed their assault with relentless fury. The massive ram, a crude construct of felled trees reinforced with iron spikes, slammed into the ancient outer gate, again and again, its handlers roaring with savage glee. The gate, a relic of a forgotten era, splintered further with each impact. Even the dark enchantments Roland had woven into its timbers could not hold against the sheer brute force of the Wa. The Greenskin war-boss loomed in the distance, his guttural command spurring his horde to ever greater frenzy. "The gate will fall," Roland said, his voice as cold and steady as the grave. Sir Gavrin, standing at his side, nodded grimly. "We must prepare for the breach." Roland's gaze shifted downward to the courtyard below, where Doran paced like a caged beast. The savage knight's mismatched armor clinked with each movement, and his jagged blade rested loosely in his hand. Even from this distance, Roland could see the feral glint in Doran's eyes. "He's waiting," Gavrin muttered, "like a wolf for the slaughter." Roland inclined his head. "And he will find it." The gate falls. With a final deafening crack, the outer gate gave way. The massive doors burst inward, shattering into splinters as the greenskins poured through the breach. Goblins swarmed forward first, their high-pitched shrieks filling the air, followed by hulking orcs wielding axes and crude cleavers. Their momentum carried them into the courtyard, where they were met by the grim host of undead defenders. Doran was the first to charge. With a guttural roar, he hurled himself into the fray, his jagged blade cutting a bloody swath through the greenskin ranks. He moved with a ferocity that bordered on madness, his every strike fueled by the savage instincts that had defined him in life. Goblins screamed as his blade tore through their ranks, their frail bodies no match through his brute strength. Even the orcs hesitated as he carved a path through their number, their confidence faltering in the face of his relentless assault. "Come on, you bastards," Doran bellowed, his voice a mix of rage and dark humor. "Let's see what you're made of." Cobra screamed. "A savage stand. A savage stand." The greenskins swarmed him, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm even his undead endurance. Yet Doran fought on, his blade a blur of jagged steel as he cut down foe after foe. Blood and ichor coated the ground around him, the stench of death, mingling with the acrid smoke of the battlefield. Roland watched from the battlements, his crimson eyes narrowing as he observed the unfolding carnage. Doran's ferocity was both a weapon and a liability, a reminder of the man he had been in life. The dishonored mercenary, reviled and cast out by his own kind, had found purpose in the chaos of undeath. Now that purpose burned brighter than ever, a flame that threatened to consume him. The war boss, towering above his minions, snarled as he spotted Doran's rampage. With a guttural roar, he barked an order, and a group of heavily armed orcs surged forward, their massive frames dwarfing even Doran's imposing bulk. Reluctant valor. Doran met them head-on, his jagged blade ringing against their crude axes and cleavers. The clash was brutal, a whirlwind of steel and savagery that left both combatants bloodied and broken. For every orc that fell, another stepped forward, their sheer weight of numbers pressing Doran back toward the shattered gate. "You'll have to try harder than that," Doran roared, his laughter cutting through the din of battle. But even his unnatural strength could not hold forever. A massive orc, its tusks glinting in the firelight, struck a savage blow that sent Doran to his knees. "Revive!" Still, he fought. His blade found the orc's throat, a spray of dark blood marking his defiance. But the horde closed in, their weapons rising and falling in a brutal rhythm. Silently, he kept watch for the weak spot. From the battlements, Roland watched as Doran fell beneath the greenskin's onslaught, his laughter finally silenced. Yet even in death, he had bought the defenders precious time. The greenskin advance slowed, their ranks thinning as the undead rallied to fill the breach. The final farewell. When the courtyard was finally secured, Roland descended to the shattered gate. Doran's broken form lay amidst the carnage, his mismatched armor dented and torn. His jagged blade was still clutched in his hand, its edge slick with the blood of his foes. Recalling Roland's memories of practicing yoga, Doran knew half the time was only intent on hearing the clank of the nail-biters. Roland knelt beside him, his gaze somber. "You fought well," he said softly, though there was no one left to hear. Sir Gavrin and the others approached, their expressions grim. "A savage to the end," Gavrin said, his tone laced with reluctant respect. Roland rose, his crimson eyes burning with cold resolve. He was more than that today. He was a knight. With a wave of his hand, Roland summoned the skeletal remains of the undead. "Take him to the crypts," he commanded. "Let his rest be undisturbed." As Doran's body was carried away, Roland turned to the shattered gate. The Greenskins would come again, stronger and more determined. But for now, they had held, and Doran's sacrifice would not be forgotten. Chapter 10. The War Boss's Challenge. The battlefield had quieted, a rare and uneasy lull in the storm of violence. The Greenskins had withdrawn just beyond the broken gate, their guttural cries echoing faintly as they regrouped. Roland stood atop the inner wall, his crimson eyes fixed on the shifting mass of orcs and goblins below. The stench of blood and fire hung heavy in the air, mingling with the acrid tang of greenskin filth. From the heart of the horde, a massive figure emerged, each of its ponderous steps shaking the ground. The war boss, a hulking brute clad in jagged armor pieced together from the wreckage of countless conquests, stomped forward. His tusks gleamed in the flickering firelight, and his beady eyes glittered with cunning malice. The war boss raised a massive cleaver, its blade crudely forged, but glinting with a dark, violent energy. His roar shattered the uneasy silence, echoing across the valley like a thunderclap. "Oi, you up there, bloodsucker," the war boss bellowed, his voice guttural and raw. "I've had enough of this mucking about. Come out and fight me one-on-one. Show me what you're made of, or I'll smash your bones myself." The greenskin horde erupted in cheers, banging their weapons against their shields and chanting in crude rhythm. Roland remained motionless, his expression impassive as he regarded the massive orc. Around him, his knights exchanged uneasy glances, the tension palpable. The choice. Sir Gavrin stepped forward, his armor still streaked with blood from the last skirmish. "My lord, it's a trap," he said, his tone firm. "He seeks to draw you out and weaken our defense." "Of course it's a trap," Lady Muriel interjected, her voice laced with sarcasm, and a rather obvious one at that. "But it's also an opportunity." Roland turned to her, his gaze cold. "An opportunity for what, Muriel?" "Betrayal. She smirked but said nothing, her silence a tacit acknowledgement. "Huh." Brother Talaric, leaning on his staff, spoke next. "The war boss wields power far beyond his kin. If you fall to him, master, we are lost." Bill headed on his way. The war boss roared again, slamming his cleaver into the ground. "What's the matter, corpse? Afraid to face me? Come on, show your lads you've got some guts." The weighing of consequences. Roland turned away from the battlements, his cape billowing as he descended the stairs to the courtyard. His knights followed, their expressions a mixture of concern and determination. "We were to take this opportunity to flee the castle before it destroyed itself. Doran bought us time," Roland said, his voice quiet but firm. "But time alone will not win this battle. The war boss is their heart. Strike him down, and the horde will falter." Sir Gavrin stepped forward, his gauntleted hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Then let me face him, my lord. I will uphold our honor." Roland stopped, turning to face his knight. "No, Gavrin. This challenge is meant for me. The war boss will not be satisfied with another." Lady Muriel scoffed. "And if you fall, what then? Shall we simply roll over and let them burn this fortress to the ground?" she said, moving. "If I fall," Roland replied, his tone ice-cold, "you will hold this fortress until there is nothing left to hold. That is your duty." Talric stepped closer, his gaunt face drawn with worry. "You do not need to do this, Master. The war boss may be powerful, but his horde is disorganized. We can withstand them." "And at what cost, Talric?" Roland asked, his gaze sharp. "How many of our number must fall before their tide ebbs?" "No, I will meet him. The decision." Roland turned to his knights, his voice firm. "Hold the gates. Do not intervene unless I fall. If I succeed, the horde will scatter. If I fail—" He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "You will defend this fortress with everything you have." Sir Gawain bowed his head. "As you command." Muriel's smirk faded, replaced by something almost resembling respect. "Try not to die too quickly." Talric inclined his head, his staff glowing faintly. "May your strength prevail." Without another word, Roland strode toward the shattered gate. The Greenskins jeered and howled as he emerged, their crude chants rising to a deafening crescendo. The warboss grinned, his tusks gleaming as he hefted his massive cleaver. "About time, corpse," the warboss roared. "Let's see if you've got the guts to back up all that fancy armor." Roland drew his sword, the ancient blade glinting with a cold, unnatural light. His crimson eyes locked onto the warboss, unblinking and unwavering. "I am Roland, blood dragon of the Valley of Shadows," he said, his voice cutting through the din, "and I accept your challenge." The Round Table's eyes flicked away from him, tread slowly crawling across them. The warboss roared with laughter, his massive frame shaking. "Then let's get crumpin', bloodsucker. I'll make a nice trophy out of your head." Experiences had begun. It was time to do his part. As the two warriors squared off, the green-skinned horde formed a wide circle, their bloodlust palpable. Roland stood alone, his knights watching from the battlements. The battle for the valley, and for the remnants of his honor, would be decided here. The duel had begun. Chapter 11. The Duel. The circle of greenskins roared in savage delight as Roland stepped forward, the sound rising like the crashing of waves against a jagged shore. The warboss stood in the center of the crude arena, his massive cleaver resting on his shoulder. His hulking frame was encased in jagged armor, each piece crudely hammered together, yet effective in its brutal design. The crude iron spikes and glyphs adorning his armor were trophies of countless victories, each one a testament to his dominance. Roland's blade gleamed coldly in the firelight, its ancient steel unmarred by time or corruption. He moved with predatory grace, every step deliberate, his crimson eyes locked onto his opponent. His presence exuded an unnatural calm, but within, the hunger stirred, a gnawing beast, eager for release. "Thrack!" The warboss grinned, his tusks gleaming as he hefted his cleaver with ease. "Look at you, all shiny and noble-like," he sneered, "thinking you're better than the rest of us. But you're just another corpse, same as the ones I've smashed before." Roland raised his blade, the tip angled toward the warboss. "Words will not save you, beast. Come, and let us end this. The battle begins. With a deafening roar, the war boss charged, his cleaver cutting through the air with terrifying speed. Roland sidestepped the first swing, his movements fluid and precise. His blade lashed out, aiming for a gap in the orc's armor, but the war boss twisted, deflecting the strike with his massive gauntlet. The clash of steel rang out, a sharp note cutting through the Greenskin's cacophony. The war boss pressed its advantage, his cleaver crashing down again and again in brutal arcs. Each blow was a test of Roland's agility and endurance, forcing the vampire to evade with hair's-breadth precision. Sparks flew as blade met cleaver, the two combatants locked in a deadly rhythm. "That is You move quick, corpse," the war boss growled, his voice thick with mockery. "But let's see how long that fancy footwork lasts." Sandra's voice was lightest. With a sudden feint, the war boss swung low, his cleaver smashing into the ground and sending a shockwave of debris into Roland's path. Caught off guard, Roland staggered, his footing faltering just long enough for the orc to close the distance. The war boss's gauntleted fist struck like a battering ram, sending Roland skidding across the dirt. Mockery and truth. The Greenskins howled with laughter and cheers as Roland rose to his feet, blood trickling from his lip. The war boss approached, his cleaver resting against his shoulder as he laughed. "What's the matter, corpse? Too busy playing knight to fight proper?" Roland wiped the blood from his mouth, his expression cold. "You mistake discipline for weakness." "Discipline? Bah!" The war boss spat, his grin widening. "Yeah, holding back. I see it in your eyes. That thirst, that hunger. You're a monster, same as me, but you're too scared to admit it." The words struck like a hammer blow, not because they were untrue, but because they weren't. Roland's grip tightened on his sword as the war boss continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Your precious honor don't mean squat out here. Honor didn't save your little fortress, and it won't save you. Just let it go, corpse. Be the beast you are. Maybe then you'll stand a chance." Period. The struggle within. Roland lunged, his blade flashing in a deadly arc. The war boss blocked the strike with his cleaver, but Roland pressed on, each blow faster and more precise than the last. Yet as the duel raged, the war boss's words echoed in Roland's mind, the truth of them clawing at his resolve. The hunger surged, a dark tide threatening to overwhelm him. It whispered promises of power, of unrelenting strength that could end this battle in moments. All he had to do was surrender, let go of the fragile ideals that chained him, let the beast within consume him. But to do so would mean forsaking everything he had once stood for. The knight he had been, the man who had fought for justice and honor, would be gone forever. "No," Roland growled, his voice barely audible over the din of the battle. He parried a strike from the war boss and countered with a precise thrust that grazed the orc's side. "I will not fall to that." For the first time in his life, turning the tide. The war boss snarled, blood seeping from the wound in his side. "Still fighting it, eh? Pathetic." With a roar, the orc swung his cleaver in a wide arc, forcing Roland to leap back. But the vampire's movements grew sharper, his strikes more deliberate. He aimed for the gaps in the war boss's armor, each blow chipping away at the orc's defenses. The Greenskins jeered and howled, their bloodlust palpable as the duel reached its crescendo. Roland's resolve hardened, his focus unshaken. This was not just a fight for survival, it was a battle for his soul. With a sudden burst of speed, Roland feinted left and then struck right, his blade slicing deep into the war boss's arm. The massive cleaver fell from the orc's grasp, embedding itself in the dirt. The war boss roared in pain and rage, swinging wildly with his remaining strength. But Roland sidestepped the attack and delivered a final, decisive blow. "To focus upon your calling, urge you to evangelism," he said, the droned blade slashing deep into the warboss's arm. The massive body slashed up and dropped to the ground. His blade pierced the warboss's chest, driving deep into the crude armor and finding the orc's black heart. The warboss staggered, his eyes wide with shock as he crumpled to his knees. Working on his face and neck, he slippered, pulling up the lid on his struck-out. For victory and resolve. The greenskins fell silent, their cheers and jeers replaced by stunned disbelief. Roland withdrew his blade, the warboss collapsing at his feet. The vampire stood over the fallen orc, his gaze sweeping the horde. "Your leader is dead," Roland declared, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. "Leave this place, or meet the same fate." For a moment, the greenskins hesitated, their brutal instincts warring with their fear. Then, slowly, they began to retreat, dragging their wounded and dead with them. Roland turned away, his blade dripping with the warboss's blood. His knights awaited him at the gate, their expressions a mixture of relief and awe. But Roland felt no triumph. The battle had been won, but the war within himself raged on. Honor had prevailed, but only just. Chapter 12. Death's Bargain. The Greenskin horde had scattered briefly after the death of their warboss, but the respite was fleeting. Like a storm rebuilding its fury, the horde reassembled under the command of the most brutal of the surviving orc leaders. The roars and chants of the greenskins echoed through the valley as they surged once more toward the fortress, their crude war machines and unrelenting numbers threatening to overwhelm the already battered defenses. Roland stood on the shattered battlements, his crimson eyes scanning the horizon. The warboss's demise had dealt a heavy blow, but it had not been enough. The horde's sheer numbers, driven by unrelenting savagery, pressed forward like an unstoppable tide. "Who has frightened you?" he screamed suddenly. Behind him, his knights gathered, weary and battle-worn. Sir Gavrin stood tall despite the dents in his tarnished armor. Brother Tauric leaned heavily on his staff, his hollow eyes flickering with the remnants of his dark magic. Lady Muriel lingered in the shadows, her emerald eyes narrowed as she studied the advancing horde. "Hystrith, I am the manor," made a nearby studio stepping forward, crossing the fire line between them. His voice steady despite the weight of the situation. "We cannot hold." Roland turned, his gaze falling on each of his knights in turn. "Then we fight," he said, his tone resolute, "to the end." Muriel's decision. Muriel stepped forward, her expression uncharacteristically solemn. "There is another way," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Roland's eyes narrowed. "Speak." Miriam hesitated, a flicker of fear crossing her face. Roland's expression darkened. "You propose to repeat that sacrifice?" "I propose to end this," Muriel replied, her voice sharp. "If we do nothing, the greenskins will tear us apart. But if I bind my essence to the wards, I can unleash their full power, scatter the horde, and ensure the fortress holds." Sir Gavrin stepped forward, his expression grim. "That is no redemption, Muriel. It is annihilation." To him. Moment of truth. Roland regarded her silently, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. Muriel had always been a creature of cunning and self-interest, her every action driven by ambition and survival. But now, standing before him, she seemed different. There was no deceit in her gaze, only a fierce determination. "If you do this," Roland said, his voice low, "there is no return, no peace. Your essence will be bound to this place, your very soul consumed." Muriel smirked, though the gesture lacked her usual venom. Peace was never meant for the likes of us. For a moment, Roland hesitated. He knew the cost of what she proposed, but he also knew it might be their only chance. Finally, he nodded. Do it. The ritual. Muriel stepped to the center of the courtyard, her movements purposeful. She raised her arms, her emerald eyes glowing with unnatural light as she began to chant. The air grew heavy, charged with a dark energy that crackled and pulsed like a living thing. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the wards etched into the stone walls flared to life, their ancient runes glowing with a blinding brilliance. The Greenskins surged forward, their war cries echoing through the valley as they stormed the gates. But as they reached the threshold, a deafening roar erupted from the fortress. The energy unleashed by the wards surged outward in a devastating wave, a torrent of raw magic that swept across the battlefield. Goblins and orcs were hurled backward, their crude war machines shattered as the wave of energy tore through their ranks. The hordes scattered in all directions, their cries of rage and terror fading into the distance as they fled. Bruno could only watch. The price paid. As the light faded, the fortress fell silent. Muriel stood at the center of the courtyard, her form shimmering and translucent. Her emerald eyes, once sharp and cunning, now glowed with a faint, ethereal light. Roland approached, his expression unreadable. "It is done," he said softly. Muriel turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "For once, I mattered." With those final words, her form dissolved into the air, the last remnants of her essence absorbed by the wards. The fortress, now imbued with her sacrifice, seemed to hum with a newfound strength, its ancient stones radiating a faint, protective glow. A grim resolve. Roland turned to his remaining knights, his expression cold and resolute. "The horde is broken for now. We will rebuild, and we will stand." Sir Gabrin bowed his head in silent acknowledgement. Brother Talric leaned heavily on his staff, his hollow gaze fixed on the ground. The cost had been great, but the fortress held. Ex-Arthur and Master Commander fell silent. As Roland gazed out over the battlefield, he felt a pang of something he could not name. Muriel, flawed and treacherous though she had been, had chosen to sacrifice herself for a cause greater than her own survival. It was a choice he would not forget, for in the Valley of Shadows even the damned could find redemption in death. Chapter 13. Desperate Measures. The once proud fortress groaned beneath the weight of its own destruction. The walls, scarred and battered by relentless siege engines, stood on the verge of collapse. Fires smoldered in the courtyard, casting a grim, flickering light over the scattered remains of the undead defenders. Each breathless moment carried the faint echo of distant Greenskin chants, growing louder as the tide of battle pressed ever closer. Roland stood on the fractured parapet, his crimson eyes scanning the horizon. The Greenskin horde had regrouped, their crude war machines repaired and bristling with deadly intent. Even with Muriel's sacrifice, the fortress had only bought itself a fleeting reprieve. The enemy would soon return, and this time, their numbers would overwhelm what few defenders remained. Behind him, Brother Talric approached, his skeletal staff clinking softly against the stone. The necromancer's gaunt face was drawn, his sunken eyes flickering with dark resolve. Views from both sides gave Brother Talric a more visceral sense of danger he hadn't experienced before. "It is time, Master," Talric said, his voice a hollow whisper. Roland turned, his expression unreadable. "Time for what?" Talric's grip tightened on his staff, the faint glow of its runes casting eerie shadows over his face. The spirit realm holds the answer. There are forces beyond this world, bound by neither life nor death. With the right invocation, we can summon them to our aid. Saranor said, "The proposal." Roland regarded Talric silently, the weight of the necromancer's words settling over him like a shroud. The spirit realm was a place of chaos and peril, its denizens unpredictable at best and malevolent at worst. To call upon such entities was to gamble not just with one's existence, but with the fate of the fortress itself. "You would risk the sanctity of this place," Roland said, his voice cold. "The wards are already strained. If your ritual fails, it will break them entirely. And if we do nothing, we are already lost," Talric countered. "You have seen the horde. Even with our strength, we cannot hold against their next assault. This is our only chance." Sir Gavrin, who had been tending to the skeletal remnants of the defenders, approached with a frown. "You would bring spirits here, Talric. Unbound, untamed, you court destruction." He smiled and tapped the crystal in place. "Destruction will come regardless," Talric replied sharply. "At least this way we may have a fighting chance." Was made to escape from the pungence.
He stood.
Roland's gaze flickered between his two knights. Gavrin, steadfast and honorable, represented the fragile ideals that had once guided him. Talric, pragmatic and unflinching, embodied the dark realities of their undead existence. The choice before him was no less fraught than the battles they had fought. "And what do you propose to summon, Talric?" Roland asked. "What price will it demand?" Next up, Dr. Strand read off 5 deadly symptoms. Talric hesitated, his bony fingers tightening around his staff. "The entities of the spirit realm thrive on chaos. They will come for the promise of blood, for the chance to revel in the destruction of our enemies. But their loyalty will be tenuous, their motives their own." Roland's jaw tightened. "And the cost? My essence will serve as the anchor," Talric admitted, his voice soft but firm. "Without it, the spirits will scatter. With it, they will remain long enough to break the horde." The ritual. After a tense silence, Roland gave a single, solemn nod. "Do it." The courtyard became a place of grim purpose as Talric prepared his ritual. Ancient runes were etched into the cracked stone, their shapes glowing faintly as the necromancer muttered incantations. The air grew thick and heavy, the scent of death and decay mingling with something far older, far darker. Roland stood watch, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Around him, the remaining undead knights formed a protective circle, their hollow eyes fixed on the advancing Greenskin horde. The enemy had begun their march, their crude banners waving in the smoky air as they approached the fortress. Talric's voice rose in a guttural chant, each word resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very ground. The runes flared brighter, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. The air crackled with energy, and shadows danced across the courtyard, taking on shapes that defied comprehension. "It might." The summoning. A deafening roar split the air as the ground beneath the runes cracked open. From the fissures emerged spectral forms, their shapes shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a tempest. Some appeared as armored knights, their visages twisted with rage and sorrow. Others were monstrous, their forms barely holding together as they howled their fury at the mortal realm. The spirits surged forward, their incorporeal forms passing through the gates and walls as they charged toward the Greenskin horde. Goblins shrieked in terror, their crude weapons passing harmlessly through the spectral entities. Orcs bellowed defiance, swinging their axes and cleavers, only to find themselves overwhelmed by the relentless onslaught. The battlefield became a cacophony of chaos as the spirits tore into the Greenskin ranks. Their presence was both mesmerizing and horrifying, a testament to the unbridled power of the spirit realm. Final sacrifice. Talric's chant faltered, his voice trembling as the strain of the ritual took its toll. His form grew translucent, the energy of the spell consuming him piece by piece. Roland stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the necromancer. "Talric," he said, his voice low. "He cannot be stopped," Talric rasped, his skeletal hand clutching his staff. "They will not stay without me." Roland's expression hardened, but he did not argue. He placed a hand on Talric's shoulder, a rare gesture of acknowledgement. "You have done your duty." With a final burst of energy, the runes blazed one last time. Talric's form disintegrated, his essence consumed by the spell. The spirits howled in triumph, their power surging as they drove the Greenskins into a full retreat. Aftermath. The courtyard fell silent once more as the last of the spirits faded, their purpose fulfilled. The Greenskin horde was shattered, their remnants scattered across the valley. Roland stood amidst the ruins of the fortress, his gaze lingering on the spot where Talric had fallen. The necromancer's sacrifice had saved them, but it had come at a cost that could never be repaid. As the remaining knights gathered around him, Roland spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of their losses. "Talric has given us this victory. We honor his sacrifice by standing strong." The fortress, battered and broken, still stood. But Roland knew the price of their survival would haunt them for eternity. Chapter 14. The Last Stand. The Valley of Shadows was bathed in a grim twilight, the air heavy with smoke and the acrid stench of blood. The shattered walls of the fortress stood as a defiant relic, battered but unbroken. Roland watched from the battlements as the Greenskin horde regrouped at the edge of the valley. Their numbers were diminished, their war cries muted by the devastation wrought by Talric's sacrifice. But they were far from broken. Roland's remaining knights gathered below him in the courtyard, their undead forms battered but resolute. Sir Gavrin stood at the forefront, his tarnished armor glinting faintly in the pale light. Despite the weight of his sins and the centuries of undeath, there was something noble in the way he carried himself now, his hand steady on the hilt of his blade. "They come again," Roland said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "This is the end." He scratched his head. The knights nodded solemnly. They had no illusions about survival. This final stand was not about victory. It was about defiance. The green tide approaches. The Greenskins began their advance, their crude banners waving as they roared their guttural chants. The ground shook beneath the weight of their march, the sound of their war drums echoing through the valley. Crude siege engines rolled forward, and the jagged weapons of the orcs glinted in the dying light. Roland descended to the courtyard, his crimson eyes sweeping over his knights. "The horde will break upon us like a tide upon the rocks," he said. "We hold, not for glory, but because it is what we must do." Sir Gavrin stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. "Then let us meet them as knights. Let them see the strength of the damned." "Nothing else matters outside the ship," said Zegarash. Roland regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded. "You will lead the charge." Gavrin's redemption. As the Greenskins closed the distance, Gavrin took his place at the head of the undead defenders. His voice rang out like a clarion call, carrying the weight of his lost humanity. The rushing was here. "Brothers and sisters, we stand together," he shouted. "We may be cursed, but we are still knights. Let us show these beasts what it means to fight with honor." The skeletal warriors, the remaining knights, and the shambling dead rallied to his cry. There was no fear in their hollow eyes, only the grim resolve of those who had nothing left to lose. When the Greenskins breached the outer wall, Gavrin charged. His sword gleamed as it cut through the air, striking down the first orc to cross his path. He moved with the precision and purpose of a man reborn, each strike a testament to the virtues he had once abandoned. His presence was a beacon, rallying the undead around him as they met the Greenskin horde head-on. The clash of steel. The courtyard became a maelstrom of chaos as the two forces collided. Goblins shrieked as they were cut down by skeletal blades, their flimsy armor offering little protection. Orcs bellowed their defiance, swinging their crude axes and cleavers with brutal strength. The undead fought without fear, their movements mechanical and unyielding. Gavrin was everywhere at once, his blade flashing as he cut through the Greenskin ranks. He barked orders, his voice steady and commanding even amidst the cacophony of battle. "Hold the line, protect the gates, no one retreats." Roland fought alongside his knights, his ancient sword carving a path through the enemy. But even as he struck down Greenskin after Greenskin, his gaze kept returning to Gavrin. The fallen paladin fought with a fervor that transcended his undead state, embodying the knightly virtues he had once forsaken. A moment of triumph. As the battle raged on, the Greenskin advance began to falter. Gavrin's leadership had turned the tide, his unyielding resolve inspiring the defenders to push back against the horde. For a moment, it seemed as though the fortress might endure. But the Greenskin war machine was relentless. A massive orc wielding a crude battering ram smashed through the remaining gate, smashing the defenders. Gavrin turned to face the new threat, his blade steady despite the overwhelming odds. "Fortress," he roared, charging toward the orc with a battle cry that seemed to echo through the ages. The two clashed in a brutal exchange, Gavrin's skill and speed pitted against the orc's sheer brute strength. With a final decisive strike, Gavrin drove his blade through the orc's chest, felling the massive creature. The final stand. Gavrin staggered, his armor rent and his movement slowing. He turned to his comrades, his voice ragged but resolute. "Hold your ground. For the valley. For honor." Roland stepped forward, his sword raised high. "For Gavrin. For the Valley of Shadows." The remaining defenders rallied once more, their collective will driving them into the fray. Gavrin's sacrifice had given them hope, a fleeting but powerful force that carried them through the final moments of the battle. And might remembered, as the last Greenskin fell, the battlefield fell silent. Roland stood amidst the carnage, his sword dripping with blackened ichor. He turned to where Gavrin had fallen. The knight's form crumpled, but his hands still clutching his sword. Kneeling beside him, Roland placed a gauntleted hand on Gavrin's shoulder. The fortress stood, battered and broken, but still standing. The Greenskins were defeated, their remnants scattered into the darkness. Roland rose, his gaze sweeping over the surviving defenders. "This is our legacy," he said, his voice cold and resolute. "We are the damned, but we endure." As the first rays of false dawn pierced the valley, Roland turned toward the shattered gate. The battle was over, but the cost would linger forever, in the memories of the dead. Sealed in the tunnel below the gateway, former dead commander. Chapter 15. The Fall of the Fortress. The once mighty fortress of the Valley of Shadows lay in ruin, its battered walls now little more than jagged skeletons of stone. The battle had raged for hours, the air thick with the acrid scent of smoke and blood. Greenskin war cries and the clash of steel against bone filled the air, their cacophony relentless. Roland stood at the shattered battlements, his crimson eyes fixed on the advancing tide of orcs and goblins that surged forward like a flood. The gate had long since fallen. The outer walls had crumbled under the battering rams, and the courtyard was now a blood-soaked testament to the sacrifice of the undead knights who had once called this place home. The remaining defenders, those who still clung to the fading vestiges of life, had fought with a desperation born of knowing they had no future. Roland felt it too. The end was near. Talaric's last gamble. Beside him, Brother Talric stood amidst the ruins, his gaunt form glowing with the pale light of necromantic energy. The runes etched into his staff pulsed faintly, but there was something different now, something desperate in the air. Talric's eyes were wild, his breath coming in ragged gasps, as he muttered incantations too dark for even the spirits of the dead to fully comprehend. "Talric?" Roland said, his voice steady despite the growing pressure of the impending doom. "What are you planning?" Roland was on his feet and scanned the room. Talric turned to him, his skeletal features twisted in an expression of both resolve and agony. "I can't hold them off much longer, but if I release the full power of the magic within me, I can take many of them with me. We can still buy time for what remains. Can you tell?" Roland's gaze darkened. "You know the cost." Talric's lipless grin faltered. "I know, but what is one more death, Roland? We have nothing left. We fight for nothing but to deny them the victory." Roland's gaze flicked to the horde, their war drums shaking the earth, their numbers seeming endless. He understood the inevitability, the crushing weight of their defeat. The Greenskins were too many. The fortress was too far gone. Talaric's offer, his dark magic, was their last hope, however slim. The unleashing of power. With a final, defiant cry, Talric thrust his staff into the ground, the runes flaring with unearthly power. A pulse of energy erupted from him, a shockwave of dark magic that reverberated through the very stones of the fortress. Roland felt it, an overwhelming surge of malevolent force that tore through the battlefield like a whirlwind. The undead defenders, already exhausted and ravaged, found themselves swept up in the flood of necromantic energy. The Greenskins faltered, their ranks momentarily disrupted by the explosive wave. Goblins were torn apart by the raw power, their bodies disintegrating into ash, while orcs howled in pain and confusion as the ground beneath them trembled. But it was not enough. Talric's body buckled under the strain of his own dark magic. His eyes flashed with a twisted ecstasy, but there was no joy in his expression, only the grim understanding that he was sacrificing himself utterly. The energy swirled around him, devouring his essence, as the undead necromancer was consumed by the very power he had sought to command. "This is my choice now." A great wail tore from Talric's throat, a sound that shook the very heavens. His form disintegrated into a cloud of shadow and smoke, leaving nothing but the aftermath of his dark ritual. The final charge. The explosion of necromantic power had taken a heavy toll on the Greenskins, but it had also cost the last of Talric's strength. The horde was momentarily scattered, but the forces of the undead had been diminished almost beyond repair. Roland, his mind sharp as ever, saw the reality of the situation. The fortress was lost. Still, the Greenskins regrouped, their savage resolve renewed. The orcs roared as they closed the gap, their crude axes raised high, the battle cries reverberating through the valley like a death knell. "Hold them," Roland commanded, his voice echoing across the shattered courtyard. But the undead knights, those few still standing, were too few to hold the line. The horde surged forward, a wall of flesh and fury. Orcs and goblins clashed against the skeleton warriors, cutting through their ranks with savage glee. One by one, Roland's companions fell. Sir Gavrin, once a paladin of unmatched valor, struck down beneath the weight of the enemy's fury. Lady Muriel, her treachery now irrelevant, cut down by a savage orc warlord. Even Doran, whose bloodlust had once fueled him, met his end as an orc cleaver struck through his chest. The collapse. Roland fought on, but he could feel it, the weight of failure. The last of his knights were dying. The fortress, once a beacon of defiance against the forces of darkness, was now nothing more than a crumbling ruin. The Greenskins, drunk with bloodlust and victory, swarmed over the last of the undead defenders. Roland's sword cut through them with practiced ease, but the numbers were overwhelming. The last of the defenders had fallen, and now the enemy closed in around Roland himself, their jeers and taunts filling the air. His sword faltered, the weight of his centuries of existence bearing down on him, the bloodthirst, the darkness, the eternal damnation. He had fought for so long, and for what? What was the cost of his endless struggle? But even in the face of annihilation, Roland's resolve remained unshaken. He would not fall quietly. Not here, not now. The final moment. The fortress had fallen. The last stand was over. Roland stood alone in the ruins of his domain, his sword raised in defiance as the Greenskin horde encircled him. He could hear their laughter, their guttural cries of victory. The sky above was painted with the crimson hues of a dying sun, and the valley, once home to his noble ideals, was now a graveyard. As the first blows struck him, Roland's final thoughts were not of victory or defeat. They were not of the life he had once lived, nor the endless curse that had bound him to this fate. They were of the comrades who had stood beside him, the knights who had chosen to fight until the very end. With a final, defiant roar, Roland met his end, the weight of his cursed existence lifting as he fell into the eternal night. The Valley of Shadows was no more. 2/2. Chapter 16. The Blood Dragon's Fury. The green-skinned horde surged through the broken remains of the fortress, their savage cries of triumph reverberating through the crumbling walls. Flames consumed the last remnants of the once proud stronghold, their light casting grotesque shadows across the battlefield. The ground was littered with the remains of the undead defenders, shattered bones and rusted armor glinting faintly beneath the encroaching darkness. Roland stood alone in the courtyard, his crimson eyes burning like twin embers in the chaos. Around him, the greenskins closed in, their weapons raised high and their guttural jeers echoing through the smoke-choked air. His knights were gone, their sacrifices etched into the ruins around him. The fortress had fallen, but Roland remained, a solitary figure of defiance amidst the tide of destruction. The hunger roared within him, an insatiable beast clawing at the edges of his resolve. For centuries, he had restrained it, clinging to the vestiges of honor and humanity that had defined him in life. But now, in this moment of utter despair, he let go. With a guttural snarl, Roland unleashed his fury. The transformation. The air grew cold and heavy, the oppressive weight of Roland's power silencing even the greenskin horde for a fleeting moment. His once calm demeanor shattered, replaced by a primal, terrifying presence. His crimson eyes flared with an otherworldly light, and his fangs, long concealed, glinted in the firelight. Shadows coiled around him like living things, their movements erratic and menacing. The greenskins hesitated, their brutish instincts warning them of the danger. But hesitation turned to rage as their war cries resumed, and they surged forward, eager to claim the blood dragon's head. They never reached him. Storm of violence. Rhodes moved with a speed and ferocity that defied comprehension. He was a blur of motion, his blade cutting through greenskin flesh like a scythe through wheat. Goblins screamed as his claws tore through their ranks, their frail bodies collapsing in heaps. Orcs, massive and brutish, found their strength meaningless as Roland's ancient sword pierced their thick hides with unerring precision. Each movement was a deadly dance, a symphony of violence and destruction. Roland's vampiric strength was unmatched, his every strike leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. He tore through the horde with an animalistic ferocity, his roar echoing through the valley like the cry of some ancient predator. "Come to me," he bellowed, his voice reverberating like thunder. "Face your doom, you wretched beasts." Aelith stared at him for a long moment, the tall of fury. But even as Roland unleashed his full power, the horde's sheer numbers pressed against him. For every greenskin he felled, two more took their place, their crude weapons hacking at him from all sides. Blades and cleavers found their mark, cutting through his armor and biting into his undead flesh. Black ichor seeped from his wounds, but Roland fought on, undeterred by the pain. A massive orc charged him, wielding a jagged axe the size of a small tree. Roland met the creature head-on, his sword clashing against the axe with a deafening crash. The orc snarled and pressed forward, its brute strength pushing Roland back. But with a sudden burst of speed, Roland sidestepped the blow and drove his blade through the orc's chest, twisting it as the creature fell to its knees. "Dr. Carterson," he said kindly as he stepped behind Roland. Another orc struck from behind, its cleaver carving a deep gash into Roland's side. He snarled in pain, spinning around to crush the attacker with a single devastating blow. More followed, their savage attacks relentless. Roland's strength, though immense, began to falter under the unending onslaught. Grievous wounds. Roland's once pristine armor was now a ruin of torn metal and bloodied leather. His movements, though still powerful, grew slower, each strike costing him more effort than the last. The Greenskins, sensing their advantage, pressed harder, their crude weapons battering against him. The goblet darted forward, its dagger slicing across his thigh. An orc followed, its mace slamming into his shoulder with bone-cracking force. Roland roared in pain, his crimson eyes blazing as he swung his blade in a wide arc, cutting down those who dared to approach. But his wounds multiplied, each one sapping his strength. Despite the pain, Roland refused to fall. He fought like a cornered beast, his fury driving him forward, even as his body began to betray him. Blood and ichor dripped from his wounds, staining the ground beneath his feet. The Greenskins, though fearful, were relentless, their numbers seeming endless. Terrifying silence. The Greenskin horde began to falter, their confidence shaken by the sheer carnage Roland had wrought. The courtyard, once filled with the sound of their war cries, was now eerily silent, save for the labored breathing of the blood dragon. Around him lay the broken bodies of his enemies, a testament to his unmatched fury. But Roland was grievously wounded. His sword, heavy with the weight of battle, hung loosely in his hand. His armor was shredded, his pale skin marred by countless cuts and gashes. He stood amidst the ruins of his fortress, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. The Greenskins watched him warily, their brutish instincts warning them to stay back. For now they hesitated, uncertain whether to press the attack or retreat. Crispin knew they wanted to help, and he wanted to find what it was they were thinking of. Roland's voice cut through the stillness, low and filled with defiance. "Is that all you have?" he growled, his crimson eyes burning despite the toll on his body. "Come then, face me. I am not done." The Greenskins roared, their fear giving way to rage as they prepared to charge once more. Roland raised his sword, his battered form still exuding an aura of unyielding defiance. The blood dragon's fury was not yet spent. Chapter 17. The Survivors. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered stone, broken bones, and smoldering fires. The air was thick with the acrid stench of blood and charred flesh. The faint cries of the dying greenskins fading into an ominous silence. The once proud fortress of the Valley of Shadows was no more. Its walls crumbled, its towers reduced to rubble. Roland stood amidst the ruins, his body broken but unbowed. His ancient blade, slick with the blood of countless foes, hung heavy in his grasp. Around him lay the remains of his knights, their lifeless forms a stark reminder of the price they had paid. Only one still stood, Sir Gavarin. Gavarin limped to Roland's side, his once shining armor dented and bloodied. His sword arm hung at an awkward angle, his shield lost somewhere in the chaos. Yet his eyes, hollow and unyielding, gleamed with an unyielding resolve. "We are all that remains," Gavria said, his voice steady despite the pain lacing his words. "But we still stand." Roland nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where the greenskins regrouped. Among them, a figure loomed larger than the rest, the war boss, clad in jagged armor, his tusks gleaming in the firelight. The orc's guttural roars carried across the battlefield, rallying his battered forces for one final assault, the final challenge. The war boss stepped forward, his massive cleaver resting on his shoulder. His armor was battered, a testament to the carnage he had endured, but his presence was as commanding as ever. Around him, the greenskins rallied, their jeers and chants growing louder as they prepared to strike the final blow. "Oi, bloodsucker!" the war boss bellowed, his voice a guttural snarl. "You ain't dead yet. Good. Let's finish this." Roland straightened, his crimson eyes locking onto the war boss. Despite the exhaustion weighing him down, a flicker of defiance burned within him. "You'll find me harder to kill than you imagine, beast." Gavarin stepped forward, his sword raised. "We face him together, my lord. One last time." Roland turned to his knight, his expression unreadable. "You owe me nothing, Gavarin. You can still retreat." Gavarin shook his head. "No, I failed once in life. I will not fail again in death." The battle. The war boss charged, his cleaver cutting through the air with terrifying force. Roland and Gavarin met him head-on, their blades flashing as they struck in unison. The clash of steel on steel echoed across the ruins, each blow a contest of strength and skill. "Ugh!" Roland darted forward, his blade aimed for the gaps in the war boss's armor. The orc parried with surprising speed, his massive cleaver swinging in a deadly arc that forced Roland to leap back. Gavarin seized the opening, his sword driving toward the war boss's exposed flank. The strike connected, drawing a roar of pain from the hulking brute. The war boss retaliated, his cleaver crashing down with bone-shattering force. Gavarin raised his sword to block, the impact sending him staggering. Roland lunged, his blade slicing across the war boss's arm, forcing the orc to drop his cleaver for a moment. But the greenskin leader's fury only grew, and he lashed out with a gauntleted fist, striking Roland and sending him sprawling. Gavarin's sacrifice. The war boss turned his attention to Roland, his tusks glinting as he raised his cleaver for the killing blow. But before it could fall, Gavarin charged, his battered form slamming into the war boss with all the force he could muster. The two figures tumbled to the ground, the war boss roaring in rage as Gavarin's sword pierced his chest. "Go," Gavarin shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "Finish this." Roland staggered to his feet, his crimson eyes blazing as he saw Gavarin grappling with the war boss. The orc's massive hands closed around Gavarin's throat, but the knight did not relent, his blade twisting deeper into the greenskin's flesh. Gavarin rose to a couriery spring, but the orc's act proved too much. With a surge of strength, Roland raised his sword and charged. The war boss turned just in time to see the blade descending, its edge catching the firelight as it drove straight through his skull. The massive orc collapsed with a guttural roar, his body shuddering once before falling still. The aftermath. Roland knelt beside Gavrin, who lay motionless beside the war boss's lifeless form. The knight's armor was shattered, his body broken beyond repair. Yet in his final moments, his face was serene. "You fought well," Roland said softly, his voice heavy with something that might have been sorrow. "You redeemed yourself." Vern's lips curled into a faint smile. "At last, I was a knight." With those words, his form crumbled into ash, carried away by the wind. A hollow victory. The green-skinned horde, leaderless and demoralized, scattered into the valley. Roland stood amidst the ruins, his sword hanging loosely at his side. The fortress was gone, his knights fallen, but the valley had been saved, for now. As the first light of dawn pierced the smoke-filled sky, Roland turned to the horizon. He was alone, the last sentinel of the Valley of Shadows, bound by his curse to endure. In the silence that followed, Roland whispered, "This is our legacy, to stand, even when all else falls." Chapter 18. The Price of Victory. The Valley of Shadows lay silent. The cacophony of war, the clash of steel, the guttural roars of greenskins, the cries of the fallen, had faded into an oppressive stillness. Smoke curled upward in languid tendrils from the smoldering remnants of the fortress, mingling with the faint haze of dawn. The once bustling stronghold was now a graveyard of shattered stone and splintered bones, its walls crumbled and its towers broken. Roland stood at the highest intact point of the ruins, his crimson eyes scanning the valley below. The greenskin wow was gone, their leaderless ranks scattering like leaves before the wind. The warbands, deprived of the unifying force of their war boss, had turned on one another in a frenzy of bloodlust and betrayal. Some fled into the hills, others fought among themselves for scraps of glory. But none dared remain in the shadow of the fortress they had sought to claim. Victory, if it could be called that. The hollow silence. The courtyard was littered with the remnants of the battle, shattered weapons, broken bodies, and the charred remains of siege engines. Among the ruins lay the forms of the knights who had stood beside Roland, their undead forms now truly lifeless. Each of them had given everything, their sacrifices etched into the very stones of the fortress. Gavrin, whose courage and leadership turned the tide in their darkest hour, was gone, his ashes carried away by the wind, left behind only the memory of a knight who had finally reclaimed his honor. The rebel tribes of Connacht, Talric, consumed by the very magic he had wielded, had become part of the valley itself, his essence woven into the shadows that clung to the ruins. Lady Muriel, whose cunning and treachery had found a strange redemption in her ultimate sacrifice, was now just another ghost haunting the Valley of Shadows. They were all gone. All except for Roland. The weight of loss. Roland descended from the battlements, his steps slow and deliberate. He moved through the ruins of the courtyard, his gaze lingering on the places where his knights had fallen. Each step was a reminder of the cost of their stand, the weight of their sacrifices pressing down on him like the very stones of the fortress. He paused before the broken gate, its jagged remnants still bearing the marks of the greenskin assault. This had been their first line of defense, where Doran had made his savage stand. Roland could still hear the echoes of the mercenaries' defiant laughter, the roar of his final charge. He had died as he had lived, unrelenting, brutal, and utterly fearless. Further into the courtyard, Roland stopped where Gavrin had made his last stand. The knight's blade, shattered in the battle, lay among the debris. Roland knelt and picked it up, turning the broken weapon over in his hands. "You found your way back," he murmured, his voice soft and filled with something that might have been regret. "Even in death, you were a knight." The desolation of the valley. As the sun rose higher, its light pierced the veil of smoke that hung over the valley. What it revealed was a land scarred and desolate. The once verdant fields surrounding the fortress were trampled into lifeless mud. The forests at the valley's edge burned to ash. Their rivers ran red with the blood of the fallen, their waters tainted by the carnage. Roland turned his gaze outward, his eyes sweeping the horizon. The valley had been his sanctuary, a place where he had sought to carve out some semblance of purpose in his cursed existence. Now it was a wasteland, a monument to the price of defiance. The Greenskins were gone, but their mark remained, and the fortress, his fortress, was no more. The burden of survival. Roland stood alone amidst the ruins, the weight of centuries pressing down on him like never before. He had fought for honor, for purpose, for the memory of what he had once been. Yet in the end, all that remained was ash and silence. He turned his gaze to the horizon, the crimson glow of his eyes dimming. "You are all gone," he said quietly, his voice carrying into the emptiness. "Yet I remain." The curse of the blood dragon was a cruel one. Undeath had granted him strength and endurance, but it had also condemned him to eternal solitude. The knights who had fought beside him, flawed and noble in equal measure, were gone. And he, the last sentinel of the Valley of Shadows, was left to carry their memory, a grim resolve. Roland gripped the hilt of his sword, the blade still stained with the blood of his enemies. He turned back to the ruins of the fortress, his crimson eyes gleaming once more. The valley was broken, the fortress a shadow of what it had been, but it was still his. "This place is mine," he said, his voice steady and cold. "It will remain so until the end of time." The Valley of Shadows was a graveyard now, but it was also a testament, a monument to the sacrifices of those who had fought to defend it. And Roland, burdened by the weight of his survival, would guard it for as long as his cursed existence endured. In the desolation he found his purpose, renewed. Chapter 19. Eternal Vigil. The Valley of Shadows, once scarred by the savagery of battle, had fallen into an eerie silence. The sun, veiled behind thick clouds, cast long, mournful shadows over the ruins of the fortress. The air was heavy with the stench of death and the faint, acrid tang of smoke. Roland stood at the threshold of what remained of his stronghold, the jagged remnants of its walls looming like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. He had won, if victory could be called this, a barren land, a shattered fortress, and a solitude that stretched into eternity. The Greenskin horde was broken, their leaders slain, but the price of their defeat was carved into every stone and every corner of the valley. Roland stepped through the crumbling gates, the weight of his existence pressing down on him like never before. The halls of memory, the interior of the fortress was cloaked in darkness, broken only by the faint flicker of dying embers from the fires that had ravaged it. The grand hall, once a place of grim purpose and determination, now stood empty, its walls scorched and its banners torn. Roland's boots echoed hollowly against the stone floor as he walked, his crimson eyes sweeping over the devastation. Every step brought with it memories. The laughter of Doran, his savage nature finding strange camaraderie among the knights. Muriel's sharp wit and cunning, her sly smirk masking the fear and ambition that had driven her. Tauric's quiet mutterings as he worked his dark magic, his skeletal hands weaving spells that had saved them time and again. And Gavrin, steadfast Gavrin, whose honor had shone brightest in the moments when all seemed lost. Their echoes haunted the halls, phantoms of what once was. Roland paused before the great hearth, now cold and lifeless. He could almost see them there, gathered as they had been before the siege began, flawed, broken, but resolute. His knights, his family, a vow in the dark. Roland moved deeper into the fortress, descending into the crypts below. The air grew colder, the weight of the earth pressing down like a shroud. Here, among the ancient stones and forgotten relics, he found solitude. The crypts were silent, save for the faint rustle of unseen vermin and the soft drip of water from the cracked ceiling. He knelt before a shattered altar, its surface covered in dust and the remnants of forgotten prayers. His sword, its ancient blade still stained from the battle, rested across his knees. Roland bowed his head, his crimson eyes closing as he let the silence envelop him. "I am the last," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying through the emptiness. "They fought, and they fell, not for glory, but for this place, for what it stood for." He lowered his eyes until they could meet. His hands tightened around the hilt of his sword. "I swore to protect it, to protect them, and though they are gone, my oath remains." The words echoed in the dark, a solemn vow that carried the weight of centuries. Roland opened his eyes, their crimson glow piercing the shadows. "I will guard this valley. I will keep it safe, for eternity, if need be." The haunting of sacrifice. The crypts were not entirely silent. Roland could hear them, whispers in the darkness, faint and fleeting. The echoes of his knights lingered here, their voices a soft murmur that danced at the edge of hearing. He could almost make out their words, fragments of conversations long past. "You'll never be rid of me, you know," Doran's voice, rough and teasing, seemed to say. "Not even in death. I gave everything for this place." Muriel's sharp tones, now tinged with regret. Perhaps it was enough. "Duty is its own reward," came Gavrin's steady voice, a reminder of the man he had been. "And its own punishment." Roland rose, his sword gleaming faintly in the dim light. The whispers faded as he walked, but their presence lingered, a reminder of the sacrifices that had been made. He ascended the steps back to the fortress's ruined halls, his movements slow but purposeful. The eternal watcher. From the highest remaining tower, Roland gazed out over the valley. The landscape was barren, the fields trampled, the rivers tainted with blood. Yet in its desolation it was still his. The Valley of Shadows had become a graveyard, a testament to the price of defiance. And Roland, the last of its defenders, would watch over it for as long as his cursed existence endured. "It will not fail," he murmured, the wind carrying his words into the void. Not again. Gaia woke from his nap. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the valley was plunged into darkness. Roland remained, a lone sentinel against the encroaching night. The fortress was empty, its halls filled only with the echoes of memory and the weight of eternity. But Roland stood firm, his crimson eyes watching, his oath unbroken. In the Valley of Shadows there was no peace, only the eternal vigil of the last night. Chapter 20. Legend and Lament. The Valley of Shadows, once alive with the clash of battle and the cries of the fallen, had grown silent once more. Yet, Beyond its borders, the echoes of what had transpired within its cursed confines began to spread. Survivors of the Greenskin flawed, those few who had fled in terror after the fall of their war boss, carried with them tales of horror and death. The valley became a name spoken only in whispers, a place of dread that even the most hardened warriors dared not approach. The Greenskin accounts. From the northern hills to the southern wastes, the scattered remnants of the Greenskin horde told their stories. Around campfires, goblins chittered nervously, their wide eyes darting as they recounted the horrors they had seen. Orcs, their crude bravado tempered by fear, growled tales of the blood dragon who had torn through their ranks like a force of nature. They say he didn't bleed. One orc muttered, his massive hand tightening on the haft of his axe. We smashed him, cut him. But he just kept coming, like he were made of stone. And his knights, a goblin chimed in, his voice trembling. Bones and shadows, all of them. They don't stay down. You kill one, and there's another right behind it. The stories varied, growing more outlandish with each retelling, but one detail remained constant. The valley was cursed, and the blood dragon who ruled it was a being of unrelenting fury and unmatched power. The dragon, who was being raised by his verdict, was called Tenmel, a grim warning. Among the human villages and border towns near the valley, traders and travelers began to speak of the tales carried by Greenskin refugees. Words spread quickly, as rumors often did. The Valley of Shadows, a merchant whispered to a gathered crowd at a wayside inn. A graveyard, they say. The undead walk there, led by a knight with eyes like fire. He'll strike down any who dare trespass. Nuzasund. In the courts of petty lords and wandering mercenary companies, the name of the blood dragon grew into legend. Some dismissed it as a myth, a tale to frighten children and deter would-be bandits. Others took it as a warning, a sign that the valley was best left untouched. Yet there were always those who sought to test the boundaries of such warnings. Adventurers and treasure hunters, drawn by the promise of wealth hidden within the ruins of the fortress, ventured into the valley. None returned. The legacy of the blood dragon. Roland's name, though spoken only in hushed tones, became synonymous with the valley itself. To some, he was a guardian, a knight whose cursed existence was bound to the land he had fought to protect. To others, he was a monster, a remnant of an ancient age who feasted on the blood of the living and ruled his desolation with an iron will. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Roland remained within the ruins of the fortress, the silence broken only by the faint whisper of the wind and the occasional echo of a long-lost voice. The halls were empty, yet filled with memories that refused to fade. He walked among them, his crimson eyes unyielding as he surveyed the land he had sworn to guard. The weight of eternity. Years passed, then decades. But Roland endured. The valley, though scarred and desolate, began to reclaim itself. Grass grew over the blood-soaked ground, and trees, twisted and skeletal, began to sprout at the edges of the battlefield. Yet the fortress remained a ruin, untouched by time, a testament to the battle that had been fought there. Roland's thoughts often drifted to his knights, their faces etched into his memory. Gavrin's steady resolve, Miriel's sharp cunning, Talric's dark brilliance, and Doran's savage humor. They had all fought, fallen, and, in their own ways, found redemption. Their echoes lingered in the halls, faint reminders of the lives they had lived and the sacrifices they had made. "You are gone," Roland murmured one night as he stood atop the highest remaining tower. His voice, carried by the wind, seemed to fade into the darkness. but your legacy endures. In this valley, in the silence, and in me, a legend carved in stone. As the centuries stretched on, the Valley of Shadows became a place of myth. Maps marked it with warnings. Here be curses. Travelers avoided its borders, their steps quickening when they came too close. Scholars debated the truth of the stories, some dismissing them as mere folklore, others insisting they were rooted in fact. And still, Roland remained. He stood as he always had, a sentinel against time, his oath unbroken. The valley was his, not out of conquest or desire, but because it was the last thing he had. The burden of his curse was heavy, but it was one he bore willingly, for it was all that tethered him to a world that had long since forgotten his name. The Lament of the Undead. In the end, the Valley of Shadows was more than a place. It was a warning, a legacy, and a lament. It was a monument to the sacrifice of flawed heroes, to the cost of defiance, and to the enduring strength of a cursed knight who refused to yield. Roland, the blood dragon, remained. Alone, yet never truly alone, haunted by the memories of his knights, and bound to the land by a vow that would outlast eternity. I am told I'm greatly alone, Raoul thought as he slept on, reluctant to get up and give them the news of his present appearance. Instead, he came forward and put his hand compassionately on Raoul's shoulder. And in the silence, his legend grew.